Hitting record. There we go. Well, all right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my talk. So the study of how and when and which people moved in the past is one of my favorite topics when approaching archaeology. And it's not just because myself and my friends and many of you in the audience have been skilled migrants due to academia and archaeology specifically, as we move within and across geopolitical borders. As we've moved, our bodies have been microcosms of the causes and effects, known as the push and pull effects of movement, that humans have experienced as long as we've been humans. Transferring, absorbing, and remixing ideas and technology, exchanging material goods, and yes, being exposed to and carrying new diseases. We've met the loves of our lives, or at least someone right for now, while on the move. And when people move, we reshape our identities to reflect both where we're from and where we've been, and becoming something not quite either. So for today, I have quite a simple vision for our talk, where I'm going to first outline the basic principles of isotopic analysis and how it's conducted on living tissues to address archaeological questions, and talk about the two most common isotopes used to address questions of mobility and migration. Then I'm going to talk about a project I've been working on in the ancient Levant and what kinds of questions we can ask that are specific to a certain site and time period. And finally, I just want to wrap this up to talk more generally about some of the challenges I've encountered while using isotopic research, or isotopic methods in the Levant, with the hopes of either letting others in the audience know that they're not alone if they're facing these challenges, or maybe even to ask the audience for help if any of you have any thoughts or suggestions during the discussion portion of this talk. First, I'd like to make a note on the terminology, because we often use the words migration and mobility, and there's different ways for how these words can be used. The first is that the two words are synonymous and completely interchangeable. Another would be that mobility refers to temporary movement, while migration is permanent settlement in a new area. I do like this one, as temporary movement is important within that person's last lifetime and can still have lasting cultural, pathological, and genetic effects. Mobility might also be the movement within the boundaries of a geopolitical region, while migration is movement between geopolitical boundaries. So, for example, this is the difference between moving from Damascus to Aleppo versus moving from Damascus to Giza. And you see this a lot in several modern sociological studies, this use of the terminology. And finally, we can think of mobility as the capability to move, while migration is the actual movement. This is ultimately the set of definitions that I try to use within my papers, because talking about the capability to move is an important consideration, as that capability is affected by several socioeconomic, physiological, and geophysical factors. And there are a lot of really interesting ways to study mobility and migration, but the one I focus on is stable isotope analyses. Now, isotopic analysis is based on this very simple principle that when we live, we build our bodies out of the food that we eat and the water that we drink. And when we die, our tissues will continue to reflect the environment that we lived in. By using a machine known as a mass spectrometer, we can analyze small pieces of bone, teeth, and other tissues, with samples often weighing only a few milligrams. One of the major isotopic systems that we look at is strontium. Now, strontium readily replaces calcium in the inorganic or the mineral portion of the bone or other living tissues. And these values primarily reflect the underlying geology that a person lived in while these tissues were forming. As that underlying geology weathers into soil, plants uptake the strontium and it enters the food chain with ratios nearly identical to the underlying geology, which varies across the world. The molecular bonds of strontium are strong in hydroxyapatite, the mineral form that constitutes most of the composition of tooth and bone. It's stronger and less susceptible to contamination and degradation in the burial environment than many other molecular bonds and pieces that we're looking at. So this method can work even when ancient DNA and other biomolecular methods fail. This obviously is not the Levant, but Great Britain is often used as an example of what can be done with well-established strontium baseline data. The entire island system has been mapped for expected strontium ratios. The values obtained from a piece of tooth or bone then can be associated with the geographic areas that match those values. Strontium will never give you a postcode, but you can identify with some confidence who didn't grow up locally, and a well-established baseline lets you start narrowing down the possibility of ranges. So this paper by Snook et al. Is one that I particularly like, where they looked at individuals from Stonehenge and were able to sort of confidently say who was local and non-local and what range of areas within Great Britain could have matched different strontium values. So that's what you can do with a really good strontium baseline. Now, oxygen isotope analysis is a little more complicated, making it less ideal as a method for identifying mobility and migration in the past, but it is a really good secondary data point to strontium. Oxygen in humans is largely reflective of the water from food and drink, and oxygen stable isotope ratios are generally indicative of climate, the attitude, the latitude, altitude, precipitation, and temperature of a given area. If someone could mute, that would be great. So this is the predicted annual mean precipitation values of oxygen using modern data. And so you can see that there are warmer areas in the lower latitude with higher oxygen values, with these higher oxygen values to the south. And then you can sort of see these lower oxygen values suggestive of cooler climates in the north, as well as in elevated areas such as in mountain ranges. Now, the key word here for this graph is modern, as climate change can alter oxygen values quite greatly over relatively short periods of time, especially compared to how strontium values tend to change on the timescale of geological processes rather than climatic change. And of course, data like this in terms of precipitation values are really great, but local precipitation values aren't necessarily going to be reflective of the drinking water that humans imbibe coming from wells and springs. And I don't want to get into too much of a spiral of what isotopes can't do, because that can obviously be a whole lecture series. But I would like to focus a little bit about what we can do, especially within the ancient Levant. So I'd like to talk today about one site as an example of some of the questions we can ask surrounding movement and how we can approach those questions using isotopic analyses. Specifically, today I'm going to talk about the site of el-Marra in modern Syria, which I had the pleasure of collaborating on my last project, the Hyksos Enigma. Excavations on this multi-phase 25-hectare site were first conducted by a Belgian team in the 1970s and 80s, before being taken on as a shared project between Johns Hopkins University and the University of Amsterdam in 1994. Now, the site of el-Marra is on a Cretaceous sedimentary soil, while Lake Jabul to the south is a rich wetlands environment used for fishing, hunting, and livestock grazing, and is composed of more recent alluvial settlements from the Quaternary period. Much of the wider Jabul plain surrounding el-Marra is composed of Paleogene era sediments, and there's not going to be a test about the geology at the end of this, but this helps sort of set the stage for strontium values. The settlement would have made use of the Jabul plain for dry farming and pastoralism in the early Bronze Age and Middle Bronze Age periods. The city was well situated as a potential route from the agricultural zone on the Euphrates Valley to the east and the pastoralist zone to the west. Between 3000 to 1500 BCE in Western Syria and Upper Mesopotamia, a collapse or series of collapses are hypothesized to have occurred. although syntheses of the evidence seem to suggest natural cycles of regional rises and declines in political centralization and urbanization. And I'm not here to argue about the collapse, but that provides some context for what happened at el-Marra and what the lead archaeologist's focus has been over the years of the site, if you want to do some more reading about these questions of urban collapse. Now, in the early Bronze Age, the dominant political forces at play in the wider region would have been Ebla to the west, Mari to the south, and Tel Brak to the east. These settlements were often in opposition, with lesser kingdoms in the in-between areas generally holding allegiance to one of these higher powers. With el-Marra smaller than these large regional centers, for example, Ebla is 56 hectares, but el-Marra is larger than the surrounding village sites, which are generally less than 10 hectares. It has been posited that el-Marra is a secondary regional center. And political ties seem to have been made through gifts of valuable materials, as well as marriages through the elite ruling families. Now, el-Marra was first occupied in the early Bronze Age, around 2800 to 2200 BCE, before being abandoned towards the end of the EBA, around 23 to 2000 BCE, when a number of small villages around the site were also abandoned. The site was reoccupied in the MBA and LBA before being largely abandoned again, with only small-scale occupation during the Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman periods. The joint el-Marra project, led by Glenn Schwartz and Hans Curvers, sought to study the development of complex societies in Western Syria through time, with a focus on the Bronze Age occupations. Because of the position and the size, it has been posited that el-Marra might be the ancient city of Tuba, a small kingdom in the EB and MB ages mentioned in texts from Ebla as a subservient administrative node to the larger kingdom. Regardless of its ancient name or political connections, el-Marra would have been a fortified regional center visible in the surrounding landscape during its height of power. The Acropolis at the center contained an elite mortuary complex with 10 tombs constructed between 2500 to 2200 BCE. With their placement in the city center and the rich funerary goods found within the tomb, and the lack of other adult humans buried within the settlement, it is thought that these tombs might contain the royalty of the Bronze Age. Schwartz suggested the focalization of the mortuary complex at the center of the city would have played a role in bringing the elite dead to the forefront of the lives of the inhabitants of the city. This would have legitimized the legacy and authority of the elite through ancestor veneration rituals and their connections with the dead, solidifying the social hierarchy. This is a trait common in new and unstudied political systems used to maintain control. And the veneration of the dead is not uncommon in this time period and in this place. During the Bronze Age, the living were participating in feasts known as Kipsum in Mesopotamia and practiced throughout the ancient Near East, honoring and appeasing their dead ancestors. Food and drink were prepared, offered, and sometimes partially consumed by the living as a form of meal sharing in a ritualized setting near or inside tombs. Usually, this practice honored the ruling class and elites. And in the centuries following the creation of these tombs at el-Marra, ancestor veneration and appeasement are shown to have continued, as evidenced by the offerings of animals and installations outside of the tombs and in crevices between tombs. Infants have also been found in these areas, although child sacrifice isn't really a testable hypothesis in these instances. And the placement of infants who died of natural causes close to the resting place of those honored dead do seem just as likely. I wanted to just take the time to briefly highlight some of the finds from the tomb that really bring home the richness of these graves. Tomb 1 is a wealthy tomb from the later end of the 3rd millennium. The 5 adults in the tomb, oriented east to west, have evidence of wooden coffins around them. Skeleton D, excavated near the top of the tomb and the latest point of the tomb use, is a late teen and potentially female. From the first layer of the tomb against the southern wall, she was found curled in a fetal position around infant bones. Grave goods included 2 toggle silver pins, a gold headband with a circlet, gold bracelets, and gold beads. Skeleton A was more positively identified as female. also from the first layer of the tomb, but on the north side, and also curled in a fetal position around infant bones. She also had wealthy grave goods, including a lapis lazuli amulet and beads, golden pieces of a necklace, and a white stone seal cylinder. Pictured here is all of the complete or near complete pottery from Tomb 1, with a kitten graciously acting as the scale. Because also, in addition to the two women, skeletons B and C are males located in the middle layer below skeletons A and D. We still have a lot of grave goods associated with these two, though generally silver and bronze items rather than gold. There's also an infant below skeleton B in the southeastern corner of the tomb, mixed with the remains of two young ovicaprines that seem to be later offerings. Now, Tomb 1 isn't the only tomb, but it does contain some of the wealthiest finds and the best preserved skeletons. And as one of the more intact structures in the regions, it ends up being a bit more photogenic than the other tombs, which are less well preserved or were disturbed in antiquity. So they were even featured in a National Geographic issue where an illustrator provided this dramatic recreation of the two women buried last in the tombs, curled around the two infants. This is a table of the other tombs that are available for study from el-Marra. Now, examining locality and origin of individuals through time in these royal tombs allows us to specifically investigate how the high status of el-Marra maintained power in the smaller polity on the crossroads of major powers such as Ebla and Mari. There are sites across the Levant with a greater number of individuals and a greater breadth in terms of the experienced lives of the individuals, where we can ask deeper intra-site questions about status, gender, and occupation, and how these lived experiences affected mobility and migration. But I wanted to highlight el-Marra today to talk about how we can glean valuable insights from smaller sites, as long as we're asking targeted questions that are specific to our knowledge of what was happening in the area. Questions refined and created with the help of site archaeologists. From el-Marra, I'm specifically curious about identifying non-locals in these tombs. If we can make... Sorry. Thank you. For el-Marra, I'm specifically curious about identifying non-locals in these tombs and if we can make any guess as to where these non-locals are from and whether there are any differences in mobility over time or between the sexes. So again, the table shows the tombs excavated that I was able to analyze at least a few skeletons from. The conflict in the region made revisiting the site impossible so far. So this was just human remains that were excavated back and exported back in 2012. And with COVID, only some samples from these individuals could be examined. So we need to be accepting of our limitations. Nonetheless, there are samples from these tombs, which includes the earliest known tomb at the Acropolis, Tomb 8, Tomb 5, postulated to be the first ruler of the settlement. We need to understand what local isotopic values might look like in order to identify non-locals. And I want to apologize now if you're not too interested in this kind of visualization, but I think at this point in my career, I do get more excited by scatter plots than I do by actual images of artifacts at this point. So this chart is from a rather good master's thesis, which analyzed strontium, carbon, and oxygen stable isotopes of animals excavated from el-Marra. So the orange box here is the values of ovicaprine bone. So bone equilibrates much more readily with the local soil than teeth. So we can assume that this bone range is the local geology very specific to el-Marra. But with the enamel samples taken from each animal, we can think about movement over each individual's life. So in Compton 2020, she took 2 enamel flakes, each shown by paired by colors here, from the top of the animal's crown to over near the root junction. So from those sort of first years of life to later years of life, in order to examine movement over time. Now, the animals on their own are quite interesting, especially with the 2 equids showing very different values. But what we can also see is that one of the equids. The cattle and the sheep show values equilibrated to the very local el-Marra values. And 4 animals display values a little higher than el-Marra, shown here, with all similar values, suggesting they may have been pastured in the same place. Now, you run into a challenge here because Syria is not like Great Britain. There are very few studies of strontium across Syria, whether archaeological or of modern living samples. So some plants collected by Henderson et al. From 2009 from Jabul and Aleppo display how narrow the el-Marra strontium values are. The higher values of some of those enamel flakes are still quite close to the local values and well within the values of the wider Jabul plain, likely reflective of pasturings further from the settlement on those steppe regions until it was time to move them closer to the city. With both animals and cereal crops likely grown on the wider plain as the major source of sustenance within the city, we can expect the humans living at el-Marra to reflect this same range of values as these animals. Now, determining a local oxygen range is not as easy for us. Modern precipitation values can be estimated for the area, 6.5 plus or minus 0.3. But we know that climate change over time means that these values might not be reflective of the precipitation values of the Bronze Age. And we can't expect the local population to have relied mainly on rainwater collection for drinking water. So when we plot the individuals from the tomb, so each point here is an individual from el-Marra, with circles being female, triangles being of indeterminate sex, and squares being male. And we have strontium on the y-axis and oxygen values on the x-axis. Now the gray box shows the local strontium values as we determined using those animal remains. And oxygen values, just using the human median and interquartile range in order to determine who's well within the median. I've also written out the individual designations for the individuals who are outside of the gray box. So these are 6 individuals from el-Marra who would have grown up outside of el-Marra. They're non-locals who came in and were buried there. Now, interestingly, if you're interested in oxygen values, the median oxygen values for the individuals is close to the modern oxygen precipitation, 6.01 versus 6.3. That might simply be a coincidence, but the drinking water values of the early Bronze Age seem to be isotopically similar to modern precipitation values. When we look at the non-locals, we see that they're mostly women. Both of the richly appointed women from Tomb 1 are non-locals, as well as 2 women from Tomb 4. We do have 1 individual too poorly preserved from Tomb 7 to estimate sex, as well as 1 male from Tomb 8. The majority of individuals are local. The earliest tomb, Tomb 5, contains 2 local individuals. This is suggestive that the first people leading the settlement and building it as an important crossroads did so as locals to the region. Now, the question I get asked often is, if I can identify non-locals with some confidence, can I identify where these non-locals are from? Where did these non-locals hail from? Ebla, or Mari, or somewhere else? And that's not as easy, especially in parts of the world with less baseline data, less varied values across the wider regions, or whenever we're looking at a region where individuals could be coming from just about anywhere, and so we don't have easily testable hypotheses. And in Syria, I feel like we might have all 3 problems. Those individuals who had higher oxygen values might hail from warmer regions, such as the southern Euphrates or the eastern Khabar region. But all oxygen deviants also had similar strontium values, and the eastern Khabar and the southern Euphrates are on a largely different underlying geology with published strontium ratios of different values. So it might be easier to eliminate those wider ranges and look elsewhere. And This is the nature of isotopic analysis. We never get a postcode, but we do get solid clues about people's childhood residences. And I am aware of the time, but I do want to just briefly circle back to the animal bones and teeth analyzed by Georgina Compton for her master's, because isotopic analyses, of course, isn't just about the human data. So these animals came from installations surrounding the tombs and estimated to be contemporaneous with the tomb construction. Over 40 equids have been excavated from el-Marra, including 25 that were wholly intact. While archaeological evidence shows equid burials were not uncommon in Syria and Mesopotamia at this time, el-Marra by far has the largest number of these burials. These equids are estimated to be kunga, sacred animals belonging only to royalty. These animals may have been sacrifices to act as royal retainers for the deceased. Though no chariot has been found, these animals may have been meant to pull the chariots of the dead. Many animals were placed side by side as though ready to pull a chariot, seemingly buried after having died of natural causes, with no obvious cause of death and advanced age in some of the animals. While in rigor mortis, several of these animals were buried standing up, which must have been a complicated task. All of the animals measure tall in height and are estimated to be possibly male with their size and enlarged canines. Heavy muscular development suggests draft use, and some bear evidence of lip rings that would have been common at the time and are shown in the standard of which was my title slide image. Kunga were luxury trade items, and males in particular were favored for pulling chariots of the elite. And the presence of exclusively male kunga at el-Marra further supports that the sex of the animal was important. As kunga are a royal animal, their interment in the mortuary complex may help legitimize the elite's claim to power, as well as displaying wealth. Weber, who is the zooarchaeologist for el-Marra, suggests that as kunga are most often associated with royal elites, the humans interred in the mortuary complex could be royal, and the symbolism of royal steeds in the complex may have acted as a substitute for royal humans to further solidify the elite's political position. They may have been sacrificed in place of human elites in order to bring order and peace. There is textual evidence for trade of kunga between Tel Brak and Ebla, and Tel Brak was known as a breeding ground for high quality kunga. And Compton's strontium analysis of 4 of the kunga available show 2 born and raised outside of el-Marra, her samples E1 and E3. Equids 2 and 4, meanwhile, show local strontium values, with E4 possibly raised in the surrounding pasture near the settlement's cattle and ovicaprines. Further biospheric baselines of Syria would help us consider whether E1 and E3 were traded from Ebla or Tel Brak. With my remaining time, I just want to briefly consider some of the limitations and considerations for isotopic analysis. Some of this might seem very basic to experienced researchers working with destructive sampling, such as isotopic analysis. And the first challenge is building our baselines. You heard me talking about how el-Marra, it can be a challenge to first even confidently identify locals, and then how the confidence drops rapidly when identifying the provenance of non-local individuals. And as many of you might have also experienced, sometimes the hardest grants to get are to actually build foundations for future studies. Creating these baselines for future cutting-edge research isn't as exciting as many grant bodies would prefer. And that part of a project can also be the first to cut when more modest grants are pursued. As isotopic research is useful for non-archaeological pursuits, however, understanding the breadth of funding bodies' interests has worked for some notable projects, such as Durham University's ongoing project to create a base map for Jordan. This will be hugely helpful, not only for those of us who are interested in tracking human movement in the past in that region, but it garnered interest from agricultural parties in Jordan who wanted to be able to control and protect locality and modern agricultural products such as honey and wine. In fact, one of the countries that has the best strontium baseline in the world, I would have to say, is probably France, in order to protect the origin of wine coming out of that country. Ecological studies are also greatly interested in mapping isotopic baselines for the study of migratory animals and tracking illicit trade in animal parts. So that can sometimes help us when we're trying to build these kinds of grants. Accessing and exporting samples is also a hurdle for many of us, and anyone in archaeological sciences may face greater scrutiny in our requests if destructive permissions are required. This seems really obvious, but conduct due diligence in legal and ethical exportation and access, and keep notes on requirements contingent on exports. Photography, photogrammetry, reports, and publications with due acknowledgements may vary from institute to institute and government body to government body. There can also be wide variance in what different permitters are comfortable with. I prefer personally to travel with isotopic samples in my carry-on when I'm going across countries via airplane, so that they're always by my side. But I've encountered many curators who don't prefer it that way. Others have scoffed at something so insulting to human remains and have insisted on check-in or tracked mail. Most have preferred carry-on, but it varies widely, so it's worth double checking. Have a plan and grant money to return those unused sample material. Finally, a challenge and a joy in my work is creating connections, and there's a wonderful variety of archaeological material, questions, and methods that means our field is forever being divided and subdivided, and how lucky we are that there's a little something for everyone in terms of our interests. But we are in danger of academic siloing, especially since our given department that we are seated in will always have some blind spots. Academic siloing means there's several archaeologists asking the same questions that I can address without knowing that people like me are always on the hunt for new collaborations and opportunities. We need to strive to continuously make connections, which is difficult for an introvert like me, but joyous to learn what other people are exploring. Multi-field academic institutions like Arwa are greatly helpful for this, and I'm grateful to have been invited to this lecture series. This lecture series over this past year has had such a wonderful group of talented speakers across the region. Thank you, everyone. I'll stop sharing and then we can take questions. Thank you.